The click of the empty chamber echoed through the abandoned warehouse like a death sentence. Detective Sarah Chen pressed her back against the concrete pillar, her service weapon trembling in her hands as she realized the terrifying truth. 3 bullets left in her magazine. 5 armed men still hunting her through the maze of industrial machinery and shipping containers. The blood from her shoulder wound was beginning to seep through her jacket, a crimson reminder of how quickly everything had gone wrong. Just 2 hours ago she'd been sitting in her unmarked sedan outside the docks, running surveillance on what was supposed to be a routine drug bust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now she was trapped in a deadly game of cat and mouse with members of the Volkov crime family, each one armed with automatic weapons and the kind of ruthless efficiency that came from years of violence. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe slowly despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, lessons from the shooting range when she was 12 years old. Precision over panic, kiddo, 1 shot, 1 target. Make every bullet count because you might not get a second chance. Detective Sarah Chen had always been the kind of person who noticed details others missed. Growing up in Chinatown as the daughter of a retired police sergeant, she'd learned early that survival often depended on reading the subtle signs that most people overlooked. The way someone's eyes darted toward an exit, the nervous twitch of fingers near a concealed weapon, the almost imperceptible change in breathing that preceded violence. These instincts had served her well during her 8 years with the Metropolitan Police Department, even if they hadn't always been appreciated by her superiors. At 32, Sarah was one of the youngest detectives in the Major Crimes Unit, a position she'd earned through relentless dedication and an unsolved rate that consistently outperformed her more senior colleagues. Yet despite her track record, she often found herself assigned to surveillance duty while others took the lead on high-profile cases. Lieutenant Marcus Walsh, her immediate supervisor, had a habit of explaining these assignments with phrases like good experience and paying your dues, but Sarah knew the real reason. She was methodical where others were aggressive, analytical where they preferred intuition. In a department that still valued the old-school approach of kicking down doors and asking questions later, her careful attention to detail was often seen as hesitation rather than intelligence. The morning had started like any other. Sarah arrived at the precinct at 6:30, a full hour before her shift officially began, and spent the time reviewing case files in the empty bullpen. The coffee was still brewing when Detective Tom Morrison ambled in, his tie already loosened despite the early hour. Morrison was everything Sarah wasn't in the department's eyes: loud, confident, and possessed of the kind of swagger that commanded attention in briefing rooms. "Early bird again, Chen," Morrison had commented, settling into his desk across from hers. "You know they don't pay overtime for voluntary prep time." Sarah had looked up from the file she was studying, a complex money laundering case involving several shell companies and a web of international transactions that had taken her weeks to unravel. "Just making sure I understand the connections," she'd replied, indicating the detailed chart she'd created linking various suspects and their financial activities. Morrison had glanced at her work with the kind of dismissive expression she'd grown accustomed to receiving. "You're overthinking it, Chen. Sometimes the simple answer is the right answer. Bad guys do bad things, we catch them." Case closed. The conversation had been interrupted by Lieutenant Walsh's arrival, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. Walsh was a 25-year veteran who'd earned his position through a combination of political savvy and an impressive arrest record. He commanded respect, but Sarah had learned that his respect was reserved for officers who fit his traditional mold of police work. Morning briefing in 5, Walsh had announced, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and a stack of overnight reports. "We've got developments on the Volkov investigation." The Volkov crime family had been a priority target for the Major Crimes Unit for the better part of 2 years. Led by Dmitry Volkov, a Russian immigrant who'd built a criminal empire spanning drug trafficking, money laundering, and arms dealing, the organization had proven frustratingly elusive. Every time the police seemed close to building a solid case, key witnesses would disappear or evidence would mysteriously become inadmissible. Sarah had been studying the Volkov family tree for months, identifying patterns in their operations that others had missed. While her colleagues focused on the obvious players, Dmitry himself and his lieutenant Viktor Petrov, Sarah had noticed the significance of seemingly minor figures who appeared repeatedly in financial records and surveillance reports. She'd identified at least 6 individuals who served as crucial links in the organization's money laundering operations, people who could potentially be flipped to provide testimony against the higher-ups. The briefing room was crowded when Sarah took her usual seat in the back. Walsh stood at the front, flanked by federal agents from the DEA and FBI who'd been working the case jointly with local law enforcement. The presence of federal agents always made these meetings more formal, more political, and Sarah had learned to keep her observations to herself unless directly asked. Intelligence indicates the Volkovs are planning a major shipment through the port tonight. Walsh began, indicating locations on a map of the waterfront district. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars worth of heroin, possibly enough to supply their entire East Coast operation for months. Agent Rebecca Torres from the DEA stepped forward, her crisp suit and no-nonsense demeanor commanding immediate attention. We've received information from a confidential source indicating the shipment will arrive at Warehouse 47 around midnight. The plan is to coordinate a multi-agency raid to catch them in the act of accepting delivery. Sarah studied the map carefully, noting the warehouse's location relative to other buildings, access roads and potential escape routes. Something about the setup troubled her, though she couldn't immediately identify what was causing her unease. The warehouse was isolated, surrounded by open space that would make surveillance difficult but also limit the suspect's options for escape. It seemed almost too convenient. Detective Morrison raised his hand. What's our confidence level on this source? The Volkovs haven't survived this long by being careless. Agent Torres exchanged a glance with her FBI counterpart before responding. The source has provided reliable information in the past. We believe the intelligence is solid. Walsh began assigning roles for the operation. Morrison, you'll lead the primary assault team. Rodriguez and Patterson, you're on perimeter security. Johnson and Williams, mobile surveillance units. He continued down the list, assigning each detective and officer to specific positions and responsibilities. Sarah waited for her name to be called, mentally preparing for whatever role she'd be given in the operation. When Walsh finished his assignments without mentioning her, she felt a familiar mixture of disappointment and frustration. "Lieutenant," she said, raising her hand slightly. "What about me?" Walsh looked up from his notes, his expression suggesting he'd forgotten she was in the room. "Chen, I want you on observation duty. Set up in the building across from the warehouse, maintain visual on the target location, and report any activity you observe." "Sir, I've been studying the Volkov organization extensively. I've identified several key financial operatives who might be present at this transaction. I could be more useful as part of the assault team." The room fell silent, and Sarah could feel the eyes of her colleagues upon her. She knew she was violating an unspoken rule by questioning the assignment, but her analysis of the Volkov operations had revealed details that could be crucial to the success of the raid. Walsh's expression hardened slightly. "Detective Chen, observation is a critical component of this operation. I need someone with attention to detail monitoring the situation and providing real-time intelligence to the assault teams." The dismissal was polite but firm, and Sarah recognized that pushing further would be counterproductive. "Yes, sir, I understand." As the briefing concluded, and officers began preparing for the evening operation, Sarah gathered her materials and headed back to her desk. She spent the rest of the day reviewing everything she could find about Warehouse 47 and the surrounding area, studying blueprints, satellite imagery, and previous police reports from the vicinity. The more she researched, the stronger her sense of unease became. The warehouse had been the site of several suspicious activities over the past year, but nothing that had resulted in arrests. It was owned by a shell company with ties to legitimate businesses, making it an ideal location for hiding illegal activities. Yet something about the timing and circumstances of tonight's operation felt wrong. Sarah pulled up financial records she'd been analyzing, tracing money flows through various accounts linked to Volkov Enterprises. What she found made her pause. Over the past month, there had been unusual activity in several accounts, large transfers that didn't match the family's normal patterns. It looked like they were moving money in preparation for something, but the amounts seemed too large for a single drug shipment. She cross-referenced the financial activity with surveillance reports and arrest records, looking for connections others might have missed. A pattern began to emerge, one that suggested the Volkovs might be planning something much larger than a routine drug transaction. The financial movements indicated they were liquidating assets, converting investments to cash, and moving money offshore. This wasn't the behavior of an organization planning a normal business transaction. It was the behavior of an organization preparing to disappear. Sarah printed out her analysis and headed to Lieutenant Walsh's office, hoping to share her concerns before the evening operation. She found him on the phone, apparently coordinating with federal agents about logistics for the raid. He gestured for her to wait outside until he finished his call. 20 minutes later, Walsh emerged from his office, already reaching for his jacket. "What is it, Chen? I need to get moving." "Lieutenant, I've been analyzing the financial activity associated with the Volkov organization, and I think tonight might be more complicated than we're anticipating." Sarah handed him the printed analysis. "The money movements over the past month suggest they're preparing for a major change in operations, possibly even shutting down their local activities."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Walsh glanced at the papers briefly before handing them back. "Chen, we've got solid intelligence about tonight's shipment. The feds have confirmed the information through multiple sources. I appreciate your thoroughness, but we need to focus on the operation at hand." "Sir, I think this might be a setup. The financial patterns suggest they know we're coming." "Detective Chen," Walsh's voice carried a note of warning, "your job tonight is observation and reporting. Leave the tactical decisions to the people with experience in this type of operation." Sarah felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed, but she also recognized the futility of arguing further. "Yes, sir. I'll be in position by 10 o'clock. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly as Sarah prepared her equipment for the surveillance assignment. She packed her binoculars, camera with telephoto lens, radio equipment, and extra batteries. Her service weapon, a Glock 17 with 2 spare magazines, was cleaned and checked according to department protocol. She also grabbed a tactical vest and first aid kit, though she hoped neither would be necessary during what was supposed to be a simple observation mission. As evening approached, Sarah made her way to the waterfront district. The building across from Warehouse 47 was a 4-story office complex that had been abandoned for several years. Sarah used the department's master key to gain access and made her way to the 3rd floor, where she found a window with a clear view of the target location. The warehouse sat in the middle of an open area, surrounded by empty lots and abandoned buildings. A single access road led to the facility, and Sarah could see that any vehicles approaching would be visible from a considerable distance. She set up her observation post carefully, positioning her equipment to provide the best possible view while keeping herself concealed from anyone who might be watching from the warehouse. As darkness fell, Sarah began her surveillance routine. She methodically scanned the warehouse and surrounding area, noting every detail and recording her observations in a logbook. The building appeared empty, with no lights visible and no sign of activity. Several vehicles were parked in the lot behind the warehouse, but they'd been there all day according to her earlier reconnaissance. At 11:30, Sarah's radio crackled to life. "All units, this is command. Begin moving to final positions. Maintain radio silence unless you observe target activity." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and increased her vigilance. The assault teams would be positioning themselves around the warehouse, preparing to move in once the drug shipment arrived. Morrison's team would approach from the north, while Rodriguez and Patterson covered the southern perimeter. Mobile units were stationed at key intersections to prevent any escape attempts. Midnight came and went with no sign of activity at the warehouse. Sarah continued her watch, occasionally checking in with command to report negative contact. As the minutes stretched into an hour, she began to wonder if her earlier concerns had been justified. The operation felt wrong, too quiet, too easy. At 1:15, Sarah noticed something that made her pulse quicken. A subtle movement in one of the upper windows of the warehouse, just a brief shadow that could have been dismissed as a trick of the light. She focused her binoculars on the window and waited, controlling her breathing to keep the image steady. There it was again. Someone was definitely inside the warehouse, moving carefully to avoid detection. Sarah reached for her radio to report the activity, but something made her hesitate. If the Volkovs were already in position inside the warehouse, why hadn't the drug shipment arrived? Why were they waiting in darkness without any visible preparation for receiving a delivery? Sarah expanded her surveillance to include the surrounding area, systematically scanning every building and potential hiding spot within view. What she saw made her blood run cold. In the abandoned building to the east of the warehouse, she caught the glint of metal in a 3rd-floor window, a rifle barrel, positioned to provide covering fire for anyone approaching the warehouse. She shifted her focus to other buildings and found more evidence of a setup. Muzzle flashes would occasionally reflect off metal surfaces as snipers adjusted their positions. Vehicle exhaust was visible from behind several buildings where engines were running but lights were off. The Volkovs hadn't just anticipated the police raid, they'd turned it into an ambush. Sarah grabbed her radio knowing she had to warn the assault teams before they walked into a trap. Command, this is Observer. I've identified multiple hostile positions around the target. This appears to be an ambush. Recommend immediate abort and withdrawal. Static was the only response. Sarah tried again on different frequencies, but her transmissions weren't getting through. The Volkovs had somehow jammed police communications, cutting off her ability to warn the assault teams that were even now approaching the warehouse. Sarah checked her watch. According to the operational plan, Morrison's team would begin their approach in less than 10 minutes. She had to find a way to warn them before they walked into the crossfire. Abandoning her observation post, she grabbed her essential equipment and headed for the stairwell. The abandoned office building was dark and filled with debris from years of neglect. Sarah moved carefully, using her flashlight sparingly to avoid drawing attention to herself. She needed to reach ground level and find a way to contact the assault teams before the ambush began. As she reached the second floor, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of heavy boots on concrete. Someone else was in the building, moving with the kind of purpose that suggested military or law enforcement training. She killed her flashlight and pressed herself against the wall, listening carefully to determine the direction and number of the approaching footsteps. 2 sets of boots, moving methodically through the building in what sounded like a search pattern. Sarah realized that the Volkovs had anticipated that the police would use the building for surveillance, and had sent men to neutralize any observers. She was trapped between floors, with armed enemies below, and no way to warn her colleagues about the larger ambush. Sarah drew her service weapon and checked the magazine. 17 rounds plus 2 spare magazines gave her 51 rounds total, more than enough for most situations. But if the entire operation was a setup, she might need every bullet she had. The footsteps were getting closer, and Sarah could hear voices speaking in what sounded like Russian. She had to make a decision, try to hide and hope they didn't find her, or take the initiative and attempt to neutralize the immediate threat while finding a way to warn the assault teams. Her father's training kicked in, lessons from countless hours at the shooting range, and tactical exercises he'd insisted she practice. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, kiddo, your best weapon is surprise. Make the first shot count, then keep moving. Static targets get dead. Sarah moved toward the stairwell, positioning herself at an angle that would give her a clear shot when the searchers reached her floor. She controlled her breathing, steadied her weapon, and waited for her targets to appear. The first man emerged from the stairwell cautiously, his automatic rifle sweeping the hallway as he advanced. Sarah waited until he was fully committed to the movement before firing 2 quick shots center mass. The man dropped without making a sound, his weapon clattering against the floor. The second searcher reacted immediately, calling out in Russian and firing blind into the hallway where his partner had fallen. Sarah had already moved, using the sound of automatic fire to mask her footsteps as she repositioned to a different angle. When the shooting stopped, she could hear the remaining searcher breathing heavily, probably trying to determine where the shots had come from. Sarah waited, knowing that patience was her greatest advantage. The man would have to move eventually, and when he did, she'd be ready. A minute passed in silence before the searcher began advancing again, this time more carefully. Sarah could track his progress by the subtle sounds of his movement, the soft scrape of his boots against debris on the floor. When he reached the spot where his partner had fallen, she had a clear shot at his profile. Sarah fired once, a precise shot that dropped the man instantly. 2 targets eliminated, 49 rounds remaining. She quickly searched both bodies, finding additional magazines for their weapons and confirming that they were carrying sophisticated communication equipment. The Volkovs were definitely planning something much larger than a simple drug transaction. Sarah checked her watch again. The assault teams would be beginning their approach any minute, walking directly into a trap that would likely result in multiple casualties. She had to find a way to warn them, even if it meant exposing herself to additional danger. She made her way to the ground floor, and carefully examined the area around the building. The warehouse was less than 200 meters away, close enough that she could potentially reach one of the assault teams if she moved quickly and stayed low. But crossing that open ground would expose her to fire from the snipers she'd identified earlier. Sarah studied the terrain, looking for covered approaches and potential routes that would minimize her exposure. There was a drainage ditch that ran roughly parallel to her intended path, deep enough to provide some concealment but requiring her to cross 30 meters of open ground to reach it. As she prepared to make the attempt, Sarah's radio suddenly crackled to life. The jamming had apparently been overcome, at least temporarily. Morrison's voice came through clearly. Command Assault 1 is in position, beginning approach to target. Assault 1, abort, abort. Sarah transmitted urgently. This is Observer. Multiple hostile positions identified. It's an ambush. Observer, say again. You're breaking up. Assault 1, do not approach the warehouse. It's a trap. Sarah's transmission was cut off as the jamming resumed, but she hoped she'd gotten through clearly enough for Morrison to understand the warning. She waited, watching the warehouse area for any sign that the assault teams had received her message. What she saw instead filled her with dread. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around the warehouse as the Volkovs opened fire on the approaching police teams. The distinctive chatter of automatic weapons echoed across the waterfront, punctuated by return fire from the officers' weapons. Sarah could see figures moving in the darkness, police officers seeking cover behind vehicles and concrete barriers while trying to return effective fire against enemies who had the advantage of prepared positions and superior firepower. The ambush was working exactly as the Volkovs had planned. Sarah made her decision quickly. She couldn't reach the assault teams in time to provide direct support, but she could attack the sniper positions that were pinning them down. If she could eliminate even a few of the shooters, it might give her colleagues the opportunity to withdraw or call for backup. She identified the closest sniper position located in a window of the building east of the warehouse. The range was approximately 150 meters, well within the effective range of her service weapon but requiring precise shot placement to ensure a clean hit. Sarah found a stable shooting position using a concrete barrier for support. She lined up her sights on the window where she'd seen the muzzle flashes, waiting for her target to reveal himself again. When the sniper fired his next burst, the muzzle flash illuminated his silhouette clearly enough for Sarah to acquire her target. She fired 3 quick shots, aiming for center mass. The sniper's weapon fell silent, and Sarah immediately shifted her focus to the next position. 2 more shots eliminated a second shooter who had been firing from behind a shipping container. Sarah's intervention was having an effect. With 2 sniper positions neutralized, the assault teams were able to adjust their positions and begin returning more effective fire. She could see Morrison's team advancing toward better cover, using the temporary reduction in enemy fire to improve their tactical situation. But Sarah's shooting had also revealed her position to the remaining Volkovs. Bullets began impacting the concrete around her as enemy fighters turned their attention to this new threat. She was forced to abandon her shooting position and seek new cover, knowing that staying in one place too long would be fatal. As Sarah moved between cover positions, she continued to engage targets of opportunity. Each shot was carefully aimed, conserving ammunition while maximizing effect. Her training was paying off. Years of practice at the shooting range had given her the skills necessary to engage multiple targets accurately under extreme stress. The firefight continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah found herself separated from the main battle, isolated in the industrial area with several Volkov fighters actively hunting her. Her ammunition was running low. She'd used nearly 2 full magazines and was down to her last spare. Sarah took refuge behind a large shipping container and quickly assessed her situation. She could hear at least 3 different weapons firing in her general direction, indicating that multiple enemies were closing in on her position. Her radio was completely dead now, leaving her with no way to coordinate with friendly forces or call for backup. The sound of approaching footsteps forced Sarah to move again. She low-crawled to a new position behind a concrete loading dock, trying to put distance between herself and her pursuers while conserving ammunition for when she'd need it most. As she settled into her new position, Sarah heard voices speaking Russian nearby. The men hunting her were close, probably less than 50 meters away. She checked her weapon again, confirming that she had exactly 3 rounds left in her magazine and no additional ammunition. The voices were getting closer. Sarah could distinguish at least 5 different speakers, all of them moving with the careful coordination of experienced fighters. They knew she was in the area and were systematically searching each potential hiding spot. Sarah closed her eyes and controlled her breathing, calling upon every lesson her father had taught her about staying calm under pressure. 3 bullets left, 5 enemies remaining. The mathematics were simple, but the execution would require perfect precision and flawless timing. She thought about her colleagues who were still fighting the main battle, depending on her to eliminate these flanking threats before they could join the larger engagement. She thought about all the cases she'd worked, all the victims who'd been counting on her to bring their attackers to justice. She thought about her father's voice, reminding her that sometimes the most important thing a police officer could do was what nobody expected them to be capable of. The first Volkov fighter appeared around the edge of the container, his automatic rifle raised and ready. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this moment, her weapon already aimed at the spot where she knew he would appear. Her first shot took him down instantly, clean and precise. 2 bullets left, 4 enemies remaining. The sound of her gunshot alerted the other fighters to her exact position, and Sarah could hear them coordinating their approach. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they would be close enough to overwhelm her position through sheer numbers and firepower. Sarah gathered herself for what might be the most important moments of her career. Everything she'd learned, everything she'd trained for, everything she believed about justice and protecting others would be tested in the next few minutes. The hunt was about to reach its climax, and Detective Sarah Chen was ready to prove that sometimes the most underestimated person in the room was exactly the person everyone should have been watching. Sarah pressed herself against the cold concrete of the loading dock, her heart hammering as footsteps echoed through the industrial maze around her. The Volkov fighters were methodically closing the distance, their voices carrying clearly in the night air as they communicated in rapid Russian. She couldn't understand the words, but their tone was unmistakable. They knew exactly where she was hiding. The weight of her Glock felt different now with only 3 rounds remaining. Every ounce seemed magnified, every component more precious than gold. Sarah had trained for scenarios like this at the police academy, theoretical exercises designed to test decision-making under extreme stress, but no simulation could replicate the crushing reality of being alone, outnumbered, and running out of options. A boot scraped against gravel somewhere to her left, close enough that Sarah could hear the subtle shift of tactical gear. The fighters were splitting up, attempting to surround her position and eliminate any possibility of escape. Standard military tactics, executed with the kind of precision that confirmed these weren't street criminals but trained professionals. Sarah's mind raced through her options, each possibility analyzed and discarded in seconds. She could attempt to retreat deeper into the industrial area, but that would only delay the inevitable while potentially leading her further from any possible backup. She could try to hide and wait for the search to move past her, but the systematic nature of their approach suggested they wouldn't stop until they'd cleared every potential hiding spot. The sound of automatic gunfire from the warehouse area reminded Sarah that her colleagues were still engaged in the large. Every minute she spent pinned down by these flanking fighters was another minute that Morrison's team faced superior numbers and firepower. If she could eliminate this threat, it might shift the tactical balance enough to give the assault teams a fighting chance. Sarah closed her eyes and forced herself to think like the analytical detective she'd always been, not the cornered officer she currently was. These fighters had advantages: numbers, automatic weapons, better positioning, but they also had weaknesses. They were operating in an environment they didn't know as well as she did. They were hunting a single target, which meant they had to expose themselves to locate and engage her. Most importantly, they probably underestimated what a lone police detective could accomplish with limited ammunition. The mistake they were making was the same one her colleagues at the precinct made every day. They saw her credentials, female, analytical, methodical, and assumed they understood her capabilities. They had no idea that Robert Chen had spent years training his daughter not just to shoot accurately, but to think tactically under pressure. Sarah opened her eyes and studied her immediate surroundings with renewed focus. The loading dock provided solid cover from 3 directions, but it also limited her mobility. Approximately 20 meters to her north was a cluster of industrial equipment that would offer multiple firing positions and escape routes. Between her current position and that equipment was open ground, but darkness and the angles of approach might provide enough concealment to make the movement possible. A voice called out in accented English, close enough that Sarah could distinguish individual words. "Policewoman, you are surrounded. Drop weapon and surrender. You will not be harmed." Sarah almost laughed at the transparent lie. The Volkovs hadn't set up this elaborate ambush to take prisoner. They'd planned to eliminate the entire police operation and send a message that would discourage future investigations. Surrendering would simply make their job easier. Instead of responding, Sarah used the sound of the voice to pinpoint at least one enemy position. The speaker was approximately 15 meters to her southeast, probably concealed behind the shipping container she'd used for cover earlier. His accent suggested he was one of the organization's more educated members, possibly someone with military or intelligence background. Another voice answered from a different direction, this one speaking in Russian. Sarah counted the distinct vocal patterns and estimated she was facing exactly 5 opponents, just as she'd calculated earlier. They were positioned in a rough semicircle around her location, gradually tightening the noose while maintaining fields of fire that would prevent her from escaping back toward the main battle. Sarah checked her watch, surprised to discover that less than 10 minutes had passed since the ambush began. The intensity of the situation had distorted her perception of time, making each second feel like an eternity. But the timing actually worked in her favor. The longer this engagement continued, the more likely it became that backup would arrive, or that the main assault teams would gain the upper hand. The key was staying alive long enough for that support to matter.
Sarah began moving, staying low and using the shadows cast by industrial equipment to mask her approach toward the cluster of machinery. Every step was carefully placed to avoid loose gravel or debris that might give away her position. The skills her father had taught her during childhood hunting trips proved invaluable now: patience, stealth, and the ability to move silently through difficult terrain. As she reached the edge of her cover, Sarah heard one of the fighters moving closer to her previous position. Perfect. If she could time this correctly, she might be able to engage the nearest threat while the others were still positioned to cover her old hiding spot rather than her new location. Sarah settled into a stable shooting position behind a piece of heavy machinery, her weapon trained on the area where she expected her first target to appear. Her breathing was controlled now, her pulse steady despite the circumstances. This was what she'd trained for, what her father had prepared her for during all those hours at the shooting range. The first fighter appeared exactly where Sarah had predicted, moving cautiously around the loading dock with his automatic rifle raised. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested extensive training. But his confidence was also his weakness. He was focused on the area where he expected to find her rather than scanning for new threats. Sarah's first shot took him center mass, a clean hit that dropped him instantly. The sound of her gunshot echoed through the industrial area, immediately alerting the other fighters to her new position. Sarah was already moving before the first return shots began impacting around her previous location. 2 bullets left, 4 enemies remaining. The tactical situation had improved slightly. By eliminating one fighter, Sarah had created a gap in their encirclement that she might be able to exploit. More importantly, she demonstrated that their numerical advantage didn't guarantee success against a well-trained opponent who understood how to use terrain and positioning to her advantage. The remaining fighters began moving more cautiously, their voices indicating increased urgency as they realized their quarry was more dangerous than anticipated. Sarah used their momentary confusion to reposition again, moving deeper into the maze of industrial equipment where the complex shadows and multiple levels would give her additional tactical options. As she settled into her new position, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of a helicopter approaching from the east. The deep rhythmic beating of heavy rotors suggested a police aviation unit, probably responding to the automatic weapons fire that had been echoing across the waterfront for the past 10 minutes. Help was coming, but it would still be several minutes before it arrived. Sarah just had to survive that long. The helicopter's approach seemed to energize the remaining Volkov fighters. Their voices became more urgent, and Sarah could hear them moving with increased speed toward her general area. They knew that once police air support arrived, their tactical advantage would evaporate. They needed to eliminate her quickly before the situation deteriorated further. Sarah welcomed their haste. Rushed movements led to mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities for a patient defender with good positioning and accurate shooting. She settled deeper into her concealment and waited for her next target to reveal himself. The wait wasn't long. One of the fighters, apparently frustrated by the delay, began moving aggressively through the equipment cluster, using his automatic weapon to suppress potential hiding spots with short bursts of fire. The tactic might have been effective against an untrained opponent, but Sarah recognized it as a waste of ammunition that revealed his position without actually threatening her. When the fighter paused to reload, Sarah had a clear shot at his profile. Her second bullet found its mark with the same precision as the first, another clean hit that eliminated the threat immediately. 1 bullet left, 3 enemies remaining. The mathematics were becoming more favorable, but Sarah knew the remaining fighters would be increasingly desperate and dangerous. They'd witnessed 2 of their companions fall to precise shooting from an opponent they couldn't locate effectively. Their next moves would likely be more coordinated and aggressive. Sarah was proven correct when the 3 remaining fighters began a simultaneous advance from different directions, using suppressing fire to limit her movement options while closing the distance rapidly. It was a sound tactical approach that would have been devastatingly effective against most opponents. But Sarah had one advantage they couldn't have anticipated.
During her months of studying the Volkov organization, she'd researched not just their financial operations but their tactical methods. She'd read every police report, every FBI analysis, every tactical assessment of their previous confrontations with law enforcement. She understood how they thought, how they operated, and most importantly, how they made mistakes under pressure. The Volkov fighters were trained, but they were criminals first and soldiers second. Their tactical knowledge came from experience rather than formal military education, which meant they relied heavily on aggression and firepower to overcome opposition. When faced with an opponent who couldn't be intimidated or overwhelmed, they tended to become impatient and take unnecessary risks. Sarah waited in her concealment as the three fighters converged on her position, letting them commit to their approach before revealing herself. When they were close enough that missing would be impossible, she emerged from cover with her weapon already aimed at the nearest threat. Her final bullet took down the lead fighter, but now Sarah was completely out of ammunition with two armed opponents still closing on her position. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically from a shooting engagement to something much more personal and desperate. The remaining fighters realized immediately that her weapon was empty. Their shouts of triumph echoed through the industrial area as they abandoned their cautious approach and rushed toward her position, confident that the threat had been neutralized. Sarah dropped her empty pistol and grabbed the automatic rifle from the fighter she'd just eliminated. The weapon was unfamiliar, a modern AK variant with modifications she didn't recognize, but the basic operation was similar to weapons she'd trained with during police tactical exercises. She quickly checked the magazine and found it nearly full. The first of the remaining fighters rounded the corner of her cover with his weapon raised, expecting to find an unarmed police officer. Instead, he found Sarah Chen in a stable shooting position with an automatic rifle aimed at his center mass. His surprise lasted exactly long enough for Sarah to fire a controlled burst that ended the threat permanently. One enemy remaining, the final fighter had apparently witnessed his companion's fate and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Sarah could hear him moving away from her position, probably attempting to withdraw from the engagement and regroup with whatever forces remained at the warehouse. Sarah couldn't allow that to happen. If even one of these flanking fighters escaped to join the main battle, it could tip the tactical balance against her colleagues who were still engaged with the primary Volkov force. She had to end this threat completely before it could affect the larger engagement. Sarah gathered additional ammunition from the eliminated fighters and began pursuing the fleeing enemy. The chase led her through the industrial maze toward the warehouse area, where the sound of ongoing gunfire indicated that the main battle was still raging. As she moved through the shadows, Sarah's radio suddenly crackled back to life. The jamming had apparently been overcome, at least temporarily, and she could hear fragmented transmissions from various units. Command: Assault 1 is taking heavy casualties. Request immediate backup and medical support. Air Unit 7 approaching from the northeast. Estimate arrival in 3 minutes. Perimeter teams, be advised we have multiple officers down. Repeat, multiple officers down. The situation at the warehouse was clearly desperate. Sarah's pursuit of the final flanker had brought her close enough to observe the main engagement, and what she saw confirmed her worst fears. Morrison's assault team was pinned down behind insufficient cover, taking effective fire from multiple concealed positions. At least 2 officers appeared to be wounded, and their ammunition had to be running low after more than 15 minutes of intense fighting. Sarah realized that eliminating the final flanking fighter, while important, wouldn't be enough to save her colleagues. The Volkov forces had prepared too well, positioned too effectively, and brought too much firepower to be overcome by the police units currently engaged. But Sarah had something the Volkovs didn't expect: detailed knowledge of their organization, their methods, and most importantly, their leadership structure. During her months of investigation, she'd identified the key figures who would be necessary to coordinate an operation of this complexity. If she could locate and neutralize the right targets, the entire Volkov defense might collapse. Sarah abandoned her pursuit of the fleeing fighter and instead began working her way toward the warehouse itself. If Dmitry Volkov or Viktor Petrov were on site to oversee this, they would be positioned where they could observe the entire while remaining protected from return fire. As she approached the warehouse perimeter, Sarah spotted her target. Viktor Petrov, Dmitry Volkov's primary lieutenant and tactical coordinator, was positioned on a second-floor balcony overlooking the battle. He had a clear view of the police positions and was apparently directing the Volkov fighters via radio, coordinating their fire to maximum effect. Sarah studied the approach to Petrov's position, identifying cover and concealment that would allow her to get close enough for an effective shot. The range was approximately 100 meters, well within her capabilities with the captured automatic rifle, but she'd need to account for the weapon's different ballistics compared to her familiar service pistol. Sarah began her approach, moving carefully from cover to cover while the attention of the Volkov fighters remained focused on the main engagement. As she got closer to the warehouse, she could hear Petrov's voice clearly as he issued orders in Russian, his tone calm and professional despite the chaos around him. When Sarah reached an effective firing position, she took careful aim at the figure on the balcony. Petrov was silhouetted against the lights inside the warehouse, making him an ideal target for someone with Sarah's training and patience. Sarah controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger in a smooth, controlled motion. The burst of automatic fire stitched across the balcony, and Viktor Petrov collapsed without a sound. The effect on the Volkov fighters was immediate and dramatic. Without Petrov's coordination, their disciplined defensive fire began to falter. Voices called out in confusion as the remaining fighters struggled to maintain their positions without clear leadership. Morrison's assault team, recognizing the shift in tactical momentum, immediately began advancing toward the warehouse. The police helicopter arrived overhead, adding its spotlight and potential fire support to the engagement. Within minutes, the organized Volkov defense had collapsed into individual fighters, seeking escape routes rather than continuing the fight. Sarah remained in her concealment, providing overwatch as her colleagues secured the warehouse and began processing the scene. She'd accomplished her mission, not just surviving the ambush, but turning the tactical situation around and enabling a successful police operation. As the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah felt the weight of everything that had happened. She'd killed 5 people in the span of 20 minutes, used every round of ammunition she'd carried, and demonstrated tactical skills that none of her colleagues had known she possessed. The implications would be significant.
Questions would be asked about how a detective assigned to observation duty had ended up in direct combat with multiple armed suspects. Her actions would be investigated, analyzed, and ultimately either vindicated or criticized, depending on how the department chose to frame the incident. But Sarah knew that whatever consequences followed, she'd done exactly what needed to be done. When her colleagues were in danger and the situation demanded decisive action, she'd stepped forward and proved that sometimes the most overlooked person in the room was exactly the person everyone should have been counting on. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that backup units were finally arriving to secure the scene and provide medical support for the wounded officers. Sarah saved her captured weapon and prepared to emerge from concealment, knowing that the next phase of this incident would be even more challenging than the firefight itself. She'd have to explain how a routine surveillance assignment had turned into a one-woman tactical operation that had saved her colleagues' lives and dismantled a major criminal organization's ambush. She'd have to justify every shot fired, every decision made, and every risk taken during the most intense 20 minutes of her career. But as Sarah heard Morrison's voice on the radio confirming that all officers were accounted for and the immediate threat had been neutralized, she knew that whatever questions came next, she had the only answer that truly mattered. When everything went wrong and lives were on the line, Detective Sarah Chen had been exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she'd trained her entire career to do. The warehouse fell silent, except for the steady thrum of helicopter rotors overhead and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Sarah emerged from her concealment with the captured automatic rifle held at the ready, her eyes scanning the area for any remaining threats. The spotlights from the police helicopter swept across the industrial complex, illuminating scattered debris and the aftermath of the most intense firefight in the precinct's recent history. Detective Morrison's voice crackled through her radio as communications were fully restored. "All units, warehouse is secure. We have multiple suspects down and at least 3 in custody. Medical teams needed immediately for officer casualties." Sarah keyed her radio, her voice steady despite everything she'd endured. "Command, this is Detective Chen. I'm approaching from the eastern perimeter. 5 hostiles neutralized during flanking action." A pause followed her transmission, long enough that Sarah wondered if anyone had heard her correctly. When Lieutenant Walsh's voice came through the radio, his tone carried a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Chen, repeat your last transmission. Did you say 5 hostiles neutralized?" "Confirmed, Lieutenant. 5 enemy combatants eliminated while protecting the eastern approach to prevent flanking of assault teams." Sarah could imagine the expressions in the command vehicle as her colleagues tried to process what they'd just heard. The detective they'd assigned to passive observation duty was reporting combat casualties that exceeded those of the entire assault team combined. As Sarah approached the warehouse, she could see the tactical situation more clearly.
Morrison's team had taken cover behind a cluster of concrete barriers, their positions marked by spent shell casings and the distinctive scars of automatic weapons fire. 2 officers were receiving medical attention from paramedics who'd arrived with the backup units, their injuries appearing serious but not life-threatening. The Volkov fighters who'd survived the engagement were secured with zip-tie restraints, sitting against a wall under the watchful eyes of heavily armed officers. Sarah counted 6 prisoners, a significant intelligence coup that would provide valuable information about the organization's structure and operations. Morrison himself approached Sarah as she safed her weapon and prepared to hand it over for evidence processing. His tactical vest was torn in several places, and a bandage on his left arm indicated he'd been wounded during the engagement, but his eyes held a respect that hadn't been there during the morning briefing. "Chen," Morrison said, extending his uninjured hand, "I owe you my life. We all do. If you hadn't taken out that flanking team, they would have caught us in a crossfire that none of us would have survived." Sarah accepted the handshake, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. Morrison wasn't the type to offer praise lightly, especially to someone he'd previously dismissed. "Just doing my job, detective. I'm glad everyone made it out." "Bullshit," Morrison replied with a slight smile. "Your job was sitting in a building with binoculars. What you did out here was something else entirely." Lieutenant Walsh arrived as Sarah was giving her preliminary statement to the investigating officers from Internal Affairs. Standard procedure required any officer-involved shooting to be thoroughly investigated, and Sarah's actions during the engagement would be scrutinized down to the smallest detail. But Walsh's expression suggested that official scrutiny was the least of his concerns. "Detective Chen," Walsh said, his formal tone indicating they were being observed by federal agents and department brass. "I understand you engaged multiple suspects during the operation." "Yes, sir. I identified hostile positions that posed a threat to the assault teams and took appropriate action to neutralize those threats." Walsh nodded slowly, processing not just her words but the implications of what she'd accomplished. "We'll need a detailed debriefing as soon as possible. The FBI is particularly interested in your observations about the suspects' coordination and equipment." Agent Torres from the DEA joined their conversation, her usually crisp demeanor showing signs of the stress and confusion that had characterized the entire operation. "Detective Chen, I understand you were able to identify the tactical coordinator for the hostile forces, Viktor Petrov, sir. He was directing their defensive fire from a second-floor position in the warehouse. Eliminating him disrupted their command and control structure." Torres exchanged glances with Walsh before continuing. "How were you able to identify Petrov from your observation position? He wasn't supposed to be at this location according to our intelligence." Sarah had been expecting this question, and her answer would likely determine how the department and federal agencies evaluated both her actions and the intelligence failure that had led to the ambush. "I'd been analyzing financial records associated with the Volkov organization for several months. The pattern suggested they were preparing for a major operational change, possibly liquidating their local assets. When I observed the sophisticated nature of tonight's ambush, I realized this wasn't a routine drug transaction but likely a planned confrontation with law enforcement." "You're saying you anticipated this was a trap?" Walsh asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I believe the possibility was significant enough to warrant additional caution." "Yes, sir. I attempted to communicate these concerns through proper channels before the operation commenced." The implications hung heavy in the air. Sarah was diplomatically stating that she'd tried to warn her superiors about the potential for an ambush, but her concerns had been dismissed. The failure to heed her analysis had nearly resulted in catastrophic casualties for the police units involved. Agent Torres made notes in a small notebook before looking up at Sarah with renewed interest. "Detective, your personnel file indicates you have extensive experience analyzing financial crimes and organized crime structures. Have you considered applying for a position with one of the federal task forces?" Before Sarah could respond, Walsh interjected. "Agent Torres, Detective Chen is a valuable member of our major crimes unit. Any discussions about her future assignments should go through proper departmental channels." Sarah recognized the subtle territorial dispute taking place around her. Her actions tonight had demonstrated capabilities that made her valuable to multiple agencies, and the question of where those capabilities would be best utilized was becoming a matter of interdepartmental politics. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Patricia Hendricks, the department's highest-ranking officer and a political appointee, who rarely appeared at crime scenes. Her presence indicated that tonight's events would have ramifications far beyond the immediate investigation. Detective Chen, Chief Hendricks said, approaching with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. I understand you played a significant role in tonight's successful operation. I did my duty, Chief. The assault teams performed exceptionally under difficult circumstances. Hendricks smiled at the diplomatic response. Detective, I've been briefed on your actions tonight. 5 suspects eliminated, crucial intelligence gathered, and multiple officer lives saved through decisive tactical intervention. This is exactly the kind of police work that makes our community safer. Sarah realized that Chief Hendricks was already framing tonight's events for public consumption. The story would be told as a successful police operation that disrupted a major criminal organization, with Sarah's role highlighting the department's commitment to thorough investigation and tactical excellence. But Sarah also understood the subtext. Her actions had exposed serious failures in intelligence gathering and operational planning. Questions would be asked about how the Volkovs had been able to set up such an elaborate ambush, and someone would need to be held accountable for the near disaster that had almost cost multiple officers their lives. The debriefing session that followed lasted nearly 4 hours. Sarah was questioned separately by internal affairs investigators, FBI agents, DEA personnel, and department supervisors, each group focusing on different aspects of her actions and observations. She answered every question thoroughly and honestly, providing detailed accounts of her decision-making process and tactical reasoning. The most challenging questions came from internal affairs, where investigator Captain James Rodriguez pressed her repeatedly about her decision to abandon her assigned observation post. Detective Chen, you were specifically ordered to maintain surveillance from a fixed position. Can you explain why you felt authorized to disregard those orders? Sarah had prepared for this question during the chaos of the evening, knowing that her career might depend on how she answered. Captain, I observed an immediate threat to officer safety that required intervention. My attempts to communicate this threat through normal channels were unsuccessful due to communications jamming. I made the tactical decision that saving officer lives took precedence over maintaining my assigned position. But you made that decision unilaterally, without authorization from your supervisors. Yes, sir. The situation required immediate action that couldn't wait for authorization through the chain of command. Captain Rodriguez made notes before continuing. Detective, are you familiar with department policy regarding officers who engage in unauthorized tactical actions? I am, sir. I understand that my actions will be thoroughly investigated, and that disciplinary measures may be appropriate depending on the findings of this investigation. The formal language masked the reality that Sarah's career was now in jeopardy. While her actions had saved lives and resulted in a successful operation, she'd also violated direct orders and engaged in combat outside her authorized role. The department would need to balance the positive results against the precedent of officers making independent tactical decisions. When the formal debriefing concluded, Sarah found herself alone in a conference room with Lieutenant Walsh. The federal agents had departed, the internal affairs investigators had finished their preliminary questioning, and the immediate crisis atmosphere had given way to the bureaucratic machinery of official investigation. Chen Walsh said, settling heavily into a chair across from her. We need to talk off the record. Sarah nodded, recognizing that this conversation would likely determine her immediate future within the department. Walsh rubbed his temples before continuing. What you did tonight was either the best police work I've seen in 25 years or the most serious violation of protocol in department history. Possibly both. I understand the complexity of the situation, Lieutenant. Do you? Because I'm not sure you fully grasp what's about to happen. The media is going to pick up this story, and they're going to want a narrative that makes sense. Hero cop saves the day, or rogue officer endangers colleagues by ignoring orders. The department gets to choose which story gets told. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the political dimensions of her situation. Her actions could be framed as either exemplary police work or dangerous insubordination, depending on what served the department's interests. What are you recommending, Lieutenant? Walsh leaned forward, his expression serious. Chief Hendricks wants to put you in for a commendation. The federal agencies want to recruit you for their task forces. Internal Affairs wants to write you up for insubordination. And I want to figure out how to keep one of my best detectives from getting caught in the middle of all this political bullshit. I appreciate your support, sir. Chen, you've been pushing for more significant assignments since you joined Major Crimes. Tonight proved you can handle anything we throw at you, but it also proved that when you don't get the assignments you deserve, you'll make your own. Sarah recognized the accuracy of Walsh's assessment. She had been frustrated by being consistently assigned to support roles despite her analytical capabilities and investigative skills. Tonight's events had forced her to demonstrate those capabilities in the most dramatic way possible. The question, Walsh continued, is what happens next. You can't go back to routine surveillance assignments after what happened tonight. Everyone knows what you're capable of now. What are you suggesting, Lieutenant? I'm suggesting that the department has a choice. We can treat tonight as an aberration and try to manage the fallout, or we can recognize that we've been underutilizing one of our most capable officers and make some changes. Walsh stood and walked to the window, looking out at the warehouse where crime scene technicians were still processing evidence. Chen, I'm recommending you for promotion to Detective First Class and assignment as primary investigator for major organized crime cases. You've earned it, and frankly, we need someone with your analytical skills and tactical capabilities in that role. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction at the recognition, but also wariness about the politics surrounding the offer. What about the internal affairs investigation? That'll run its course, but Chief Hendricks has already indicated that the successful outcome of tonight's operation demonstrates sound tactical judgment under extreme circumstances. Your actions will be classified as appropriate use of force in defense of fellow officers. Sarah nodded, understanding that the official narrative was being carefully constructed to protect both her and the department from uncomfortable questions about intelligence failures and operational planning. There's one more thing, Walsh added. Agent Torres has requested that you be assigned as the department's liaison to the Federal Organized Crime Task Force. It would mean working closely with FBI and DEA on major cases, potentially including continued investigation of the Volkov organization. The offer represented everything Sarah had been working toward: recognition of her capabilities, assignment to significant cases, and the opportunity to make a real impact on major criminal investigations. But she also understood that accepting would mean increased scrutiny and higher expectations for future performance. I'd like some time to consider the options, Lieutenant. Take the time you need, but don't take too long. The federal agencies are moving fast on the Volkov investigation, and they want experienced personnel assigned immediately. As Sarah left the precinct in the early morning hours, she reflected on how dramatically her career had changed in a single night. The detective who'd arrived for surveillance duty had been overlooked and underestimated by her colleagues. The detective who was leaving had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances imaginable and earned opportunities that had previously seemed impossible. But Sarah also understood that tonight had been more than just a career milestone. She'd been forced to take lives in defense of her colleagues, experienced combat that would stay with her for years to come, and demonstrated capabilities that would forever change how others viewed her role within the department. The recognition was gratifying, but it came with responsibilities that extended far beyond personal advancement. Other female officers would look to her as an example of what was possible when talent was given the opportunity to prove itself. The department would expect her to continue performing at the exceptional level she'd demonstrated tonight, and the criminal organizations she'd be investigating would now know exactly how dangerous she could be when cornered. As Sarah drove home through the empty streets, she thought about her father's reaction when he learned about tonight's events. Robert Chen had spent years preparing his daughter for challenges he'd hoped she'd never face, and tonight had proven that his training had been both necessary and successful. Sarah smiled slightly as she imagined telling him about using his lessons on patience and precision to eliminate 5 armed suspects with only 3 bullets. He'd be proud of her tactical performance, but he'd also remind her that the most important victory wasn't the fight she'd won tonight, but the opportunities she'd created for tomorrow. The sun was beginning to rise over the city as Sarah pulled into her driveway, marking the end of a night that had changed everything about her career and her future. Detective Sarah Chen had proven that sometimes the most underestimated person in the room was exactly the person everyone should have been counting on all along. 6 months after the warehouse incident, Detective First Class Sarah Chen stood before a conference room filled with federal agents, police commanders, and international law enforcement representatives. The presentation screen behind her displayed a complex organizational chart mapping the remnants of the Volkov criminal enterprise, now significantly diminished thanks to intelligence gathered from that night's operation. The financial analysis indicates that the organization has fragmented into at least 4 smaller cells, Sarah explained, using a laser pointer to highlight key connections on the chart. Each cell operates independently, but they're still linked through shared money laundering networks that we've been able to penetrate. Agent Torres, now Sarah's primary federal contact, nodded approvingly from the front row. The multi-agency task force had achieved remarkable success in the months following the warehouse raid, dismantling networks that had operated with impunity for years. Sarah's analytical approach had proven invaluable in identifying the financial vulnerabilities that traditional law enforcement methods had missed. Detective Chen asked a representative from Interpol, "What's your assessment of the timeline for completely dismantling these remaining networks?" Sarah considered the question carefully, drawing on months of investigation and analysis. "Based on current intelligence gathering and prosecution rates, I estimate we can significantly degrade their operational capacity within 12 months. Complete elimination will require continued international cooperation and sustained pressure on their financial infrastructure." The briefing concluded with assignments for the next phase of operations, a coordinated effort involving agencies from 3 countries. Sarah's role had evolved from local detective to international consultant, her expertise in financial crime analysis now recognized at the highest levels of law enforcement. As the room emptied, Chief Hendricks approached with someone Sarah didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s wearing the kind of understated professional attire that suggested federal law enforcement at a senior level. "Detective Chen," Chief Hendricks said, "I'd like you to meet Deputy Director Catherine Walsh from the FBI's Organized Crime Division." Sarah shook hands with the Deputy Director, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that characterize successful federal executives. "Ma'am, it's an honor. Detective, I've been following your work since the warehouse incident. Your analytical methods and tactical performance have impressed people at very high levels within the Bureau. I'm here to discuss an opportunity that might interest you." Chief Hendricks excused herself, leaving Sarah alone with Deputy Director Walsh. The conversation that followed would determine the next phase of Sarah's career, another decision point that traced back to that night when everything had changed. "Detective Chen, the Bureau is establishing a new unit focused on financial crimes with national security implications. We need someone who can bridge the gap between analytical investigation and tactical operations. Your background makes you an ideal candidate." Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and caution that accompanied significant career opportunities. What would the position entail? Leading a team of specialists in investigating criminal organizations that use financial networks to support various illegal activities, drug trafficking, arms dealing, human trafficking, and potentially terrorism financing. You'd have resources and authority that exceed anything available at the local level. The offer represented the pinnacle of what Sarah had been working towards since joining law enforcement: federal authority, unlimited resources, and the chance to impact criminal organizations on a global scale. But it also meant leaving the department where she'd proven herself and taking on responsibilities that would be scrutinized at the highest levels of government. "I'd need time to consider the implications, ma'am, of course. But I should mention that your current supervisor, Lieutenant Walsh, has already provided a recommendation that describes your work as the most innovative approach to organized crime investigation he's encountered in his career." Sarah smiled at the irony. Marcus Walsh, who had consistently assigned her to support roles and dismissed her analytical insights, was now recommending her for federal positions based on the same capabilities he'd previously undervalued. "Deputy Director, may I ask what specifically impressed the Bureau about my methods?" "Your ability to see patterns that others miss, combined with your willingness to act decisively when the situation demands it. Most analysts excel at identifying problems but struggle with implementation. Most tactical officers excel at implementation but miss the subtle indicators that predict where problems will emerge. You've demonstrated both capabilities at an exceptional level." As Deputy Director Walsh departed, Sarah reflected on how completely her professional life had transformed. The detective who had once struggled for recognition within her own department was now being recruited by federal agencies for positions of significant authority and responsibility. But the personal transformation had been equally profound. Sarah had been forced to confront the reality of taking lives in defense of others, an experience that had changed her perspective on both her capabilities and her responsibilities. The confidence she'd gained that night had influenced every aspect of her work, from how she approached investigations to how she interacted with colleagues and superiors. The most visible change was in how others treated her. Detective Morrison, who had once dismissed her analytical approach as overthinking, now regularly sought her input on complex cases. Lieutenant Walsh, who had relegated her to observation duties, now assigned her to lead major investigations. Even the federal agents who had initially questioned her tactical decisions now deferred to her expertise in organized crime analysis. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Rebecca Foster, a recent Academy graduate who had specifically requested assignment to Sarah's unit. The younger officer was everything Sarah had once been: brilliant, dedicated, and consistently underestimated by colleagues who focused on surface characteristics rather than capabilities. Detective Chen, I've finished the preliminary analysis on the Martinez trafficking case. Would you have time to review my findings before tomorrow's briefing? Sarah smiled as she typed her response. Foster reminded her of herself 6 months ago, eager to prove her worth and frustrated by limited opportunities. The difference was that Foster was working in an environment where analytical excellence was recognized and rewarded, largely because Sarah had fought to create that environment. Send me the analysis tonight, we'll review it together tomorrow morning and discuss presentation strategies. The mentoring relationship with Foster represented one of the most satisfying aspects of Sarah. She could provide guidance and opportunities to younger officers while ensuring that talent was recognized regardless of who possessed it. The lesson she'd learned about seeing what others missed now extended to identifying capabilities that might otherwise be overlooked. Sarah gathered her materials and headed home, thinking about the federal offer and its implications. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it would mean leaving behind the department where she'd finally found recognition and the colleagues who had come to respect her contributions. As she drove through the city streets, Sarah's route took her past the warehouse district where everything had changed 6 months earlier. The building where she'd faced 5 armed opponents with 3 bullets had been demolished as part of a redevelopment project, but the memories remained vivid. That night had proven to herself and others that she was capable of far more than anyone had imagined. Sarah's phone rang as she pulled into her driveway, displaying her father's name on the screen. Robert Chen had been following his daughter's career transformation with pride and concern, understanding better than anyone the pressures that came with rapid professional advancement. Hi Dad, Sarah, how did the federal briefing go today? Very well. They're pleased with the progress we're making on the Volkov investigation. There's also been a development regarding future opportunities. Sarah described the FBI offer as she unlocked her front door and settled into her living room. Her father listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his understanding of both the opportunities and challenges involved. It's an incredible opportunity, kiddo, but it's also a big responsibility. Federal positions come with scrutiny that's different from local law enforcement. I understand that, Dad. But it's also a chance to have real impact on criminal organizations that operate across multiple jurisdictions. What does your gut tell you? Sarah paused, considering the question that went beyond professional analysis to personal instinct. My gut tells me I'm ready for the challenge. 6 months ago I might have doubted whether I could handle that level of responsibility. But that night at the warehouse changed something fundamental about how I see myself and my capabilities. The night you learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is what nobody expects you to be capable of. Exactly, and now I have the chance to apply that lesson on a much larger scale. Robert Chen was quiet for a moment before responding. Then you already know what you're going to do. The question is whether you're ready to accept the full implications of that decision. After ending the call with her father, Sarah sat in her living room and considered the path that had led to this moment. Every challenge she'd faced, every case she'd worked, every instance of being underestimated had contributed to her development as both an investigator and a leader. The warehouse incident had been a catalyst, but it hadn't created her capabilities, it had simply revealed them in circumstances that demanded recognition. The analytical skills, tactical awareness, and determination to protect others had always been present. What had changed was her willingness to act on those capabilities regardless of official authorization or collegial expectations. Sarah opened her laptop and began drafting her response to Deputy Director Walsh. As she typed, she thought about Foster and the other young officers who would benefit from working in an environment where excellence was recognized and rewarded. She thought about the criminal organizations that continued to operate with impunity because traditional law enforcement approaches couldn't adapt to their evolving methods. Most importantly, she thought about the lesson her father had taught her about seeing what others missed, and how that principle had guided her from overlooked detective to federal recruit in less than a year. Sarah's email to Deputy Director Walsh was brief and direct. I accept the position and look forward to contributing to the Bureau's mission. I can begin the transition process immediately. As she sent the message, Sarah felt the same calm confidence that had carried her through that night at the warehouse. She was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, confident in her abilities and committed to proving that sometimes the most unexpected person was exactly the right person for the job. The young woman who had once struggled for recognition within her own department was about to become a federal agent with authority to investigate criminal organizations worldwide. The transformation was complete, but the mission was just beginning. Sarah Chen had learned that it wasn't about being seen by others, it was about seeing opportunities that others missed and having the courage to act on them when the moment demanded it. Whether facing 5 armed opponents with 3 bullets or accepting a federal position that would define her career, the principle remained the same. Excellence recognized no boundaries, and neither would she. 3 years later, Special Agent Sarah Chen walked into the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia, her footsteps echoing through the pristine hallways lined with portraits of distinguished agents and historic law enforcement achievements. Today marked a milestone she'd never imagined possible during those early days as an overlooked detective. She was about to address the graduating class of new federal agents as their keynote speaker. The auditorium was filled with fresh-faced recruits who had completed months of rigorous training in firearms, physical fitness, legal studies, and investigative techniques. Their eager expressions reminded Sarah of her younger self, hungry for opportunities to make a difference and prove their worth in a demanding profession. As Sarah approached the podium, she noticed several female recruits in the front rows watching her with particular intensity. These women would face many of the same challenges she'd encountered: subtle doubts about their capabilities, assignments that didn't match their skills, and the constant need to prove themselves in situations where their male colleagues were given the benefit of the doubt. "Future agents," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. 3 years ago I was a detective in a local police department, assigned to routine surveillance because my superiors believed that was where my talents were best utilized. Today I lead a federal task force that has dismantled criminal organizations across 4 continents. She paused, letting the significance of that transformation sink in with her audience. The difference between then and now wasn't a change in my capabilities, it was a change in how those capabilities were recognized and utilized. Sarah clicked to her first slide, displaying a map showing the global reach of the financial crimes unit she now directed. Red lines connected dozens of cities across multiple countries, illustrating the scope of investigations that had grown from her analytical approach to criminal network mapping. When people ask me about the most important lesson I've learned in federal law enforcement, they expect me to talk about tactical training or investigative techniques. Instead, I tell them about the importance of seeing patterns that others dismiss as coincidence. The presentation that followed detailed several major cases her unit had solved, each one beginning with subtle financial indicators that traditional investigators had overlooked. Sarah emphasized how analytical patience combined with decisive action had proven more effective than conventional approaches that relied primarily on informants and surveillance. Excellence in law enforcement isn't about being the loudest voice in the briefing room or the first one through the door during a raid. Sarah explained to the attentive recruits, it's about recognizing threats before they fully materialize and having the courage to act on your analysis even when others question your conclusions. During the question and answer session, a young woman in the third row raised her hand. "Agent Chen, how do you handle situations where your insights are dismissed by colleagues who outrank you?" Sarah smiled, recognizing the familiar challenge. "That's an excellent question, and it's one that many of you will face regardless of your gender or background. The key is building credibility through consistent performance while finding opportunities to demonstrate your capabilities in ways that can't be ignored." She thought about that night at the warehouse when radio silence had forced her to act independently rather than waiting for authorization that might never come. Sometimes you'll find yourself in situations where following proper channels isn't possible or practical. Those moments will test not just your training but your judgment about when rules need to be bent in service of a larger mission. Another recruit, a young man near the back, asked about working with international law enforcement agencies. Sarah's response drew on her recent experiences coordinating with European and Asian investigators who initially approached American methods with skepticism. Cultural differences in law enforcement can be challenging, but they also provide opportunities to learn new approaches to old problems.
Some of our most successful operations have combined American technological resources with investigative techniques developed in other countries. Sarah concluded her presentation with advice that reflected lessons learned through years of overcoming underestimation and proving her worth in increasingly demanding environments. Your badge and credentials will open doors, but your reputation will determine what opportunities await you behind those doors. Build that reputation methodically, be patient with the process, and remember that the most important victories are often the ones that nobody sees coming. As the recruits filed out of the auditorium, several approached Sarah with additional questions. The conversations that followed reminded her of Detective Foster and the other young officers she'd mentored during her final months at the local department. Each interaction reinforced her commitment to ensuring that talent was recognized and nurtured regardless of where it emerged. Later that evening, Sarah joined Deputy Director Walsh for dinner at a restaurant near the academy. Their professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship over the years, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to advancing law enforcement effectiveness. "Your presentation was excellent," Walsh said as they settled into their booth. "Those recruits don't realize how fortunate they are to hear from someone who's experienced the full spectrum of law enforcement challenges. I hope some of them will remember the message when they face their own moments of being underestimated or overlooked."
Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of which, I have news that might interest you. The director has approved your proposal for the International Financial Crimes Center. You'll have a budget of $15 million and authority to recruit specialists from any federal agency." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction at the announcement. The center represented the culmination of everything she'd worked toward, a dedicated facility for analyzing global criminal financial networks with resources that exceeded anything previously available to law enforcement. "When does the recruitment process begin?" "Immediately. The director wants the center operational within 6 months, with your team in place and initial investigations underway by the end of the fiscal year." As they discussed staffing plans and operational priorities, Sarah thought about the recruits she'd addressed earlier that day. Some of them might eventually join her team, bringing fresh perspectives and innovative approaches to challenges that had seemed insurmountable just a few years earlier. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone, displaying a call from Detective Foster, who had recently been promoted to lieutenant and was considering federal opportunities herself. "Excuse me," Sarah said to Walsh before answering. "Rebecca, congratulations on the promotion." "Thank you, Agent Chen. I wanted to let you know that I've been accepted for the FBI's Accelerated Agent Program. I'll be starting at Quantico next month." Sarah smiled at the news. Foster's journey from overlooked academy graduate to federal recruit had followed a similar trajectory to her own, though with better mentorship and recognition along the way. "That's outstanding news. You'll excel in the federal environment." "I hope so. I also wanted to thank you for the recommendation letter. It apparently carried significant weight with the selection committee." After ending the call, Sarah returned to her conversation with Walsh, who had observed the interaction with interest. "Another promising recruit. Someone who reminds me of myself a few years ago, but with better opportunities and guidance than I had initially." Walsh raised her wineglass in a toast to creating opportunities for the next generation and ensuring that talent is recognized wherever it emerges. As they clinked glasses, Sarah reflected on the transformation that had brought her to this moment. The detective who had once questioned whether she'd ever receive assignments matching her capabilities was now designing programs that would shape federal law enforcement for decades to come. The lesson she'd learned about seeing what others missed had evolved into a philosophy that guided every aspect of her professional life. Whether analyzing criminal networks, mentoring young officers, or building new investigative capabilities, Sarah understood that success came from recognizing patterns and possibilities that escaped conventional observation. The 3 bullets she'd fired that night at the warehouse had eliminated immediate threats, but they'd also initiated a chain of events that had transformed not just her career but her understanding of what was possible when determination met opportunity. As Sarah drove back to her hotel that evening, passing the monuments and government buildings that represented the pinnacle of federal authority, she thought about the young woman who had once sat in surveillance positions wondering if her analytical skills would ever be fully utilized. That woman had become an agent whose insights now influenced national security policy and international law enforcement cooperation. The journey from overlooked detective to federal executive had required patience, persistence, and the courage to act decisively when circumstances demanded. But most importantly, it had required the wisdom to recognize that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. Sarah Chen had learned to see what others missed, and in doing so had created a legacy that would inspire and guide future generations of law enforcement professionals who faced their own moments of doubt and challenge. 5 years after establishing the International Financial Crime Center, Director Sarah Chen stood in her corner office on the 32nd floor of the J. Edgar Hoover Building, watching the sunrise paint the Washington, D.C. skyline in shades of gold and crimson. The view from her window encompassed the monuments and government buildings that represented the highest levels of American law enforcement, a perspective that would have seemed impossible during her early days as an overlooked detective. The secure phone on her desk chimed with an encrypted message from the Attorney General's office. Sarah opened the classified communication and read the contents twice before setting the device aside with a mixture of pride and gravity. The message contained authorization for Operation Mirror Shield, the largest coordinated strike against international organized crime in federal law enforcement history. 18 months of investigation led by Sarah's team had identified a web of criminal enterprises spanning 12 countries, connected through sophisticated financial networks that had operated undetected for over a decade. The operation would involve simultaneous raids across 4 continents, targeting leadership structures that controlled drug trafficking, arms dealing, and human smuggling operations worth billions of dollars annually. Sarah's methodology had revolutionized how federal agencies approach transnational crime. Instead of focusing on individual criminal acts or organizations, her team mapped the financial infrastructure that enabled multiple criminal enterprises to function. By identifying the shared resources and support systems, they could dismantle entire networks, rather than simply arresting replaceable operatives. The approach had proven so effective that agencies worldwide now sent personnel to train at Sarah's center. The techniques developed in her modest conference rooms had become standard protocol for financial crime investigation throughout NATO countries and partner nations across Asia and South America. A knock on her door interrupted Sarah's reflection. Assistant Director Michael Torres entered carrying a stack of operational briefing materials and wearing the focused expression that characterized the final hours before major operations. Director Chen, all task force leaders have confirmed readiness. Operation Mirror Shield commences in 6 hours across all target zones. Sarah nodded, reviewing the synchronized timeline that would see federal agents, international partners, and local law enforcement agencies executing precisely coordinated strikes designed to prevent any part of the criminal network from warning the others. Casualty projections, minimal. Intelligence indicates most targets will be in administrative facilities, rather than operational sites. We expect to encounter armed resistance at perhaps 3 of the 27 locations. Sarah appreciated Torres's thorough preparation, but she also understood that even the best intelligence couldn't predict every variable in operations of this complexity. Her experience had taught her that success often depended on individual agents making correct decisions when circumstances deviated from planned scenarios. Brief all team leaders one final time about maintaining tactical flexibility. Criminal organizations survive by adapting quickly to changing circumstances, and our people need to be prepared for surprises. As Torres departed to coordinate final Sarah turned her attention to a special briefing folder marked with the highest classification levels. The folder contained intelligence that had triggered Operation Mirror Shield, evidence that the criminal networks her team had been tracking were planning to expand into cybercrime and cryptocurrency manipulation on a scale that could threaten national economic security. The discovery had elevated Sarah's investigation from a law enforcement priority to a matter of national security, bringing resources and authority that exceeded anything she'd previously commanded. The president himself had been briefed on the operation, and success would likely result in Sarah being considered for even higher positions within the federal security apparatus. But Sarah's motivation remained the same as it had been during those early days as a detective. Criminal organizations destroyed communities, exploited vulnerable populations, and corrupted institutions that served the public good. Whether she was tracking financial records in a precinct conference room or coordinating international operations from a federal command center, the mission remained fundamentally unchanged. Sarah's phone displayed a text message from Rebecca Foster, now Special Agent Foster and a key member of Sarah's leadership team. The message was brief but carried emotional weight that formal communications couldn't convey. Ready for today's operation. Thank you for showing me that being underestimated can become our greatest strength. Sarah smiled at the message, remembering her own journey from overlooked detective to federal director. Foster's career had progressed even more rapidly, benefiting from mentorship and opportunities that Sarah had fought to create. The younger agent now led international liaison operations and had earned respect from colleagues worldwide for her innovative approaches to cross-border investigation. The transformation in how talent was recognized and developed within federal law enforcement represented one of Sarah's most significant achievements. Her insistence on evaluating personnel based on analytical capabilities and investigative results rather than traditional metrics had identified numerous agents whose potential had been overlooked by conventional assessment methods. Sarah's secure computer chimed with incoming status reports from task force commanders positioned around the globe. Teams in London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Sydney were confirming final preparations for coordinated raids that would begin at precisely calculated intervals to maintain operational security across multiple time zones. The scope of the operation demonstrated how dramatically law enforcement cooperation had evolved during Sarah's tenure. Agencies that had previously guarded information jealously now shared intelligence freely, recognizing that modern criminal organizations could only be defeated through coordinated international efforts. At exactly 0600 Eastern Standard Time, Sarah activated the command center's main display screens and opened secure communication channels to all participating agencies. Operation Mirror Shield was officially commencing, representing the culmination of everything she'd learned about seeing patterns others missed and acting decisively when opportunities presented themselves. All stations, this is command. Operation Mirror Shield is now active. Execute planned assignments according to established timelines. The next 8 hours passed in a controlled symphony of coordinated law enforcement action. Sarah monitored incoming reports as teams across the world executed simultaneous strikes against carefully selected targets. The criminal network's command structure was methodically dismantled, with key leaders arrested before they could communicate warnings to subordinates. By mid-afternoon, the results exceeded even optimistic projections. 147 arrests had been made across 12 countries, with evidence seized that would support prosecutions for years to come. More importantly, the financial infrastructure that had enabled multiple criminal enterprises had been completely disrupted, forcing surviving elements to operate without the sophisticated support systems they'd relied upon. Sarah addressed the international task force via secure video conference, speaking to law enforcement professionals in languages she'd never imagined needing during her early career. Today's success demonstrates what becomes possible when we combine analytical precision with coordinated Multirektor and verbal coordinated action. This operation will serve as a model for future international cooperation against transnational crime. As reports continued arriving throughout the evening, Sarah reflected on the path that had led to this moment. A single night facing 5 armed opponents with 3 bullets had initiated a transformation that had ultimately resulted in the largest organized crime takedown in modern history. The lesson her father had taught her about seeing what others missed had evolved into a philosophy that now guided international law enforcement policy. The detective who had once struggled for recognition within her own department had created methodologies that were being taught at law enforcement academies worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had demonstrated that excellence recognized no boundaries, not of gender, background, or previous experience. Her success had opened doors for countless other talented individuals who might otherwise have remained overlooked, creating a legacy that would influence law enforcement for generations to come. As Sarah prepared to leave her office that evening, she paused at her window for one final look at the city lights spreading across the Washington landscape. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new criminal organizations to investigate, and new opportunities to prove that sometimes the most unexpected person was exactly the right person for the job. Director Sarah Chen had learned that it wasn't about being seen by others, it was about seeing possibilities that others missed and having the courage to act on them when the moment demanded excellence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.